designed to do that. It's pushing GWST probably too far to expect it to do that. But it could detect, for example, a carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere on TRAPPIST-1e. That's not a biosignature, but you could prove it's like a Venus in that case, or maybe like a Mars in that case. Like both those have carbon dioxide-rich atmospheres. Doesn't prove or disprove the existence of life either way, but it is our first characterization of the nature of those atmospheres. Maybe we can tell the pressure level and the temperature of those atmospheres. So that's very exciting. But we are competing with that, and that I think that science is completely mind-blowing and fantastic. We have a completely different objective, which is, in our case, to try and look for the first evidence of these small moons around these planets, potentially even moons which could be habitable, of course. So I think it's a very exciting goal, but attack has to make a human judgment, essentially, about which science are they most excited by, which one has the highest promise of return, the highest chance of return. And so that's hard, because if you look at a planetary atmosphere, well, you know most of the time that has an atmosphere already. And so there's almost a guaranteed success that you're going to learn something about the atmosphere by pointing GWST at it. Whereas in our case, there's a harder sell. We are looking for something that we do not know for sure exists yet or not. And so we are pushing the telescope to do something which is inherently more risky.
Yeah, but the existence, if shown, already gives a deep lesson about what's out there in the universe. And that means that other stars have similar types of variety as we have in our solar system. They have an Io, they have a Europa, and so on, which means like there's a lot of possibility for icy planets, for water, for planets that enable planets and moons like that. I mean, that's super exciting, because that means everywhere through our galaxy and beyond, there is just innumerable possibility for different creatures.
You have to I mean, NASA has been on this quest for a long time, and it's sometimes called Beta Earth. It's the frequency of Earth-like, usually they say, planets in the universe. How common are planets similar to our Earth? In terms of, ultimately we'd like to know everything about these planets in terms of the amount of water they have, how much atmosphere they have, but for now it's kind of focused just on the size and the distance from the star, essentially. How often do you get similar conditions to that? That was Kepler's primary mission, and it really just kind of flirts with the answer. It didn't quite get to a definitive answer. But I always say that if we're looking, if that's our primary goal, to look for Earth-like, I would say, worlds, then moons has to be a part of that, because we know that Earth-like, from the Kepler data, the preliminary result is that Earth-like planets around sun-like stars is not an inevitable outcome. It seems to be something like a 1 to 10% outcome. So it's not particularly inevitable that happens. But we do often see about half of all sun-like stars have either a mini Neptune, a Neptune, or a Jupiter in the habitable zone of their stars. That's a very, very common occurrence that we see. Yet we have no idea how often they have moons around them, which could also be habitable. And so it may very well be, if even 1 in 5 of them has an Earth-like moon or even a Mars-like moon around them, then there would be more habitable real estate in terms of exomoons than exoplanets.
You can essentially 2x, 3x, 5x, maybe 10x the number of habitable worlds out there in the universe at our current estimate, like the Drake equation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is one way to increase the confidence and increase the value of that parameter.
And just know where to look. I mean, we would like to know where should we listen for technosignatures, where should we be looking for biosignatures. And not only that, but what role does the moon have in terms of its influence on the planet? We talked about these directly imaged telescopes earlier, these missions that want to take a photo, to quote Carl Sagan, the pale blue dot of our planet, but the pale blue dot of an exoplanet. And that's the dream, to one day capture that. But as impressive as the resolution is that we are planning and conspiring to design for the future generation of telescopes to achieve that, even those telescopes will not have the capability of resolving the Earth and the Moon within that. It'll be a pale blue dot pixel, but the moon's grayness will be intermixed with that pixel. And so this is a big problem, because one of the ways that we are claiming to look for life in the universe is a chemical disequilibrium. So you see two molecules that just shouldn't be there. They normally react with each each other, or even one molecule that's just too reactive to be hanging around the atmosphere by itself. So if you had oxygen and methane hanging out together, those would normally react fairly easily. And so if you detected those two molecules in the pale blue dot spectra, you'd be like, okay, you have evidence for life, something's metabolizing on this planet. However, the challenge is, what if that moon was Titan? Titan has a methane-rich atmosphere. And what if the pale blue dot was in fact a planet devoid of life, but it had oxygen because of water undergoing this photolysis reaction, splitting into oxygen and hydrogen separately. So then you have all of the hallmarks of what we would think is life, but all along you would tricked. It was just a moon that was deceiving you. And so we're never going to outplay, really understand or complete this quest of looking for life biosignatures in the universe unless we have a deep knowledge of the prevalence and role that moons have. They may even affect the habitability of planets themselves, because our own moon is freakishly large. By mass ratio, it's the largest moon in the solar system. It's a 1% mass moon. Look at Jupiter's moons, our test outlines fall, much smaller. And so our own moon seems to stabilize the liquidity of our planet. It gives rise to tides, especially early on when the moon was close to those tides would have covered entire continents. And those rock pools that would have been scattered across the entire plateau may have been the origin of life on that planet. The moon-forming impact may have stripped a significant fraction of lithosphere off the Earth, which without it, plate tectonics may not have been possible. We've got a stagnant lid because there's just too much lithosphere stuck on the top of the planet. And so there are speculative reasons, but intriguing reasons as to why a large moon may be not just important, but central to the question of having the conditions necessary for life. So moons can be habitable in their own right, but they can also play a significant influence on the habitability of the planets they orbit. And further, they will surely interfere with our attempts to detect life remotely from afar.
So, taking a tangent on a tangent, you've written about binary planets. What's and that they're surprisingly common, or they might be surprisingly common. What's the difference between a large moon and a binary planet? What are binary planets? But what's interesting to say here about giant rocks flying through space and orbiting each other?
I think it's interesting that binary objects is that they're very common in the universe. Binary stars are everywhere, but the majority of stars seem to live in binary systems. When we look at the outer edges of the solar system, we see binary Kuiper objects all the time, asteroids basically bound to one another. Pluto Charon is kind of an example of that. It's a 10% mass ratio system. It almost is, by many definitions, a binary planet, but now it's a dwarf planet, so yeah, call that now. But we know that the universe likes to make things in pairs.
So you're saying our sun is an insect. it's looking. So most things are dating relationships, and ours is alone.
It's not a complete freak of the universe to be alone, but it is. It's more common for sun-like stars. If you count up all the sun-like stars in the universe, about half of the sun-like star systems are in binary or trinary systems, and the other half are single. But because those binaries are 2 or 3 stars, then cumulatively, maybe like a third of all sun-like stars are single.
I'm trying hard to not anthropomorphize the religion. I've met those folks also. So, is there something interesting to learn about the habitability, how that affects the probability of habitable worlds when they kind of couple up like that in those different ways?
Well, it depends when we're talking about the stars and the planets. Certainly, if stars couple up, that has a big influence on the habitability. Of course, this is very famous from Star Wars. Tatooine in Star Wars is a binary star system. You have Luke Skywalker look at the sunset and seeing 2 stars come down. And for years, we thought that was purely a product of George Lucas's incredibly creative mind. And we didn't think that planets would exist around binary star systems. It seems like too tumultuous an environment for a quiescent planetary disk, circumstellar disk, to form planets from. And yet, one of the astounding discoveries from Kepler was that these appear to be quite common. In fact, as far as we can tell, they're just as common around binary stars as single stars. The only caveat to that is that you don't get planets close to binary stars. They have like a clearance region on the inside where planets, maybe they form there, but they don't last. They are dynamically unstable in that zone. But once you get out to about the distance that the Earth orbits the Sun, a little bit closer in, you start to find planets emerging. And so that's the right distance for liquid water, it's the right distance for potential life on those planets. And so there may very well be plenty of habitable planets around binary stars. Binary planets is a little bit different. Binary planets, I don't think we have any serious connection of planet binarity to habitability. Certainly when we investigated it, that wasn't our drive, that this is somehow the solution to life in the universe or anything. It was really just like all good science questions, like QM-driven.
What's the dynamic? Are they legit orbiting each other as they orbit the star?
So the formation mechanism proposed here, because it is very difficult to form two protoplanets close to each other like this. They were generally merged in the disk, and so that's why you wouldn't get single planets. But you could have something like Jupiter and Saturn form at separate distances. They could dynamically be scattered in towards one another and basically not quite collide, but have a very close-on encounter. Now, because tidal forces increase dramatically as the distance decreases between two objects, the tides can actually dissipate the kinetic energy and bring them bound into one another. So that seems, when we you first hear that, you think that seems fairly contrived, that you'd have the conditions just right to get these tides to cause a capture. But numerical simulations have shown that about 10% of planet-planet encounters are shown to produce something like binary planets, which is a startling prediction. And so that seems at odds with, naively, the exoplanet catalogue, for which we know of so far no binary planets. And we propose one of the resolutions to this might be that the binary planets are just incredibly difficult to detect, which is also counterintuitive. Because remember how they form is through this tidal mechanism. And so they form extremely close to each other. So the distance that Io is away from Jupiter, just a few planetary radii, they're almost touching one another. And they're just tightly locked, facing each other for eternity. And so in that configuration, as it transits across the star, it kind of looks like you can't really resolve these two planets. It just looks like one planet to you that's going across the star. The temporal resolution of the data is rarely good enough to distinguish that. And so you see one transit, and in fact it's two planets very close together which are transiting at once. And so, yeah, we wrote a paper just recently where we developed some techniques to try and get around this problem and hopefully provide a tool where we could finally look for both planets.
The problem detection.
Yes, that was our focus, was how do you get around this merger problem. So whether they're out there or not, we don't know. We're planning to do a search for them, but it remains an open question, and I think just one of those fun astrophysics curiosities questions, whether binary planets exist in the universe. Because then you have binary Earth, you have binary Neptune, all sorts of wild stuff that would flow to the sci-fi imagination.
I wonder what the physics of binary planet feels like. It might be trivial. I have to think about that. I wonder if there's some interesting dynamics. Like, you feel multiple, or would gravity feel different at different parts of the surface of the sphere when there's another large sphere that's in
Yeah, I would think that the force would be fairly similar, because the shape of the object would deform to a flat geopotential, essentially a uniform geopotential, but it would lead to a distorted shape of the two objects. I think they become ellipsoids facing one another. So it would be pretty wild when you people like flat Earth or spherical Earth. Yeah, you fly from space and see a football-shaped Earth. Yeah,
finally, there's proof, and I wonder how difficult it would be to travel from one to the other, because you have to overcome the. Well, no, it might be kind of easy.
Yeah, I mean, they're so close to each other, that helps. And I think the most critical factor would be how massive is the planet. That's always, I mean, one of the challenges with escaping planets, there was a fun paper one of my colleagues wrote that suggested that super Earth planets may be inescapable. If you're a civilization that were born on super Earth, the surface gravity is so high that the chemical potential energy of hydrogen or methane, whatever fuel you're using, simply is at odds with the gravity of the planet itself. And so you would, our current rockets, much like the fraction, maybe like 90% of rockets fuel or something by mass. These things would have to be like the size of the Giza pyramids of fuel with just a tiny tip on the top in order just to escape that planetary atmosphere. And so it has been argued that if you live on a super Earth, you may be forced to live there forever. There may be no escape unless you invent a space elevator or something. But then, how do we even build the infrastructure in space to do something like that in the absence of a successful rocket program? And so the more and more we look at our Earth and think about the sorts of problems we're facing, the more you see things about the Earth which make it ideally suited in so many regards. It's almost spooky, right? That we not only live on a planet which has the right conditions for life, for intelligent life, for sustained fossil fuel industry just happens to be in the ground. We have plenty of fossil fuels to get our industrial revolution going. But also the chemical energy contained within those fossil fuels and hydrogen and other fuels is sufficient that we have the ability to escape our planetary atmosphere and planetary gravity to have a space program. And we also happen to have a celestial body which is just within reach, the moon, which doesn't also necessarily have to be true. Were the moon not there, what effect would that have had on our aspirations for a space program in the 1960s? Would there have ever been space race to Mars or to Venus? That's a much harder, certainly for a human program, that seems almost impossible for 1960s technology to imagine ever coming to fruition.
It's almost as if somebody constructed a set of challenging obstacles before us, challenging problems to solve. They're challenging, but they're doable. And there's a sequence to that. Gravity is very difficult to overcome, but we have, given the size of Earth, it's not so bad that it's still actually construct propulsion systems that can escape it.
Yeah. And the same with climate change, perhaps. I mean, climate change is the next major problem facing our civilization, but we know it is technically surmountable. You know, it does seem sometimes like there has been a series of challenges laid out to progress us towards a mature civilization that can one day perhaps expand to the stars.
I'm a little more concerned about nuclear weapons, AI, and natural or artificial pandemics. But yes,
plenty of milestones that we need to cross, and we can argue about the severity of each of them. But there is no doubt that we live in a world that has serious challenges that are pushing our intellect and our will to the limit of whether we're really ready to progress to the next stage of our development.
So thank you for taking the tangent, and there'll be a million more. But can we step back to Kepler 1625b? What is it? And you've talked about this kind of journey, this effort to discover exomoons, so moons out there, or small, cool objects out there. Where does that effort stand, and what is Kepler 1625b?
Yeah, I've been searching for those moons for most of my professional career, and I think a lot of my colleagues think I'm kind of crazy to still be doing that. You know, after 5 years of not finding anything, I think most people would probably try doing something else. I even had people say that to me. They said, professors, I remember a cocktail party took me to the side, an MIT professor, and said, you should just look at how Jupiter everywhere. It's really, really bad papers. They're so easy to find. And I was like, yeah, but how Jupiter's just, they're not interesting to me. I want to do something that I feel intellectually pushes me to the edge, and it's maybe a contribution that not no one else could do, but maybe is not something that anybody could do. I don't want to just be the first to something for the sake of being first. I want to do something that feels like a meaningful intellectual contribution to our society. And so, this exomoon problem has been haunting me for years trying to solve this. Now, as I said, we've looked for years and years using Kepler, and the closest we ever got was just a hint that there's one star. Kepler 1625 has a Jupiter-like planet in orbit over it, and that Jupiter-like planet is on a 287-day period, so it's almost the same distance as the Earth-like Sun for Jupiter. So that was already unusual. I don't think people realize that Jupiter-like planets are quite rare in the universe. Certainly, mini Neptunes and Neptunes are extremely common, but Jupiter's only about 10% of sun-like stars have Jupiters around them, as far as we can tell.
When you say Jupiter, which aspect of Jupiter?
In terms of its mass and its semi-attractor. So anything beyond about half an AU, so half the distance of the Earth and the Sun, and something of order of a tenth of a Jupiter mass, so that's the mass of Saturn, up to say 10 Jupiter masses, which is basically where you start to get to brown dwarfs. Those types of objects appear to be somewhat unusual. Most solar systems do not have Jupiters, which is really interesting because Jupiter, again, like the moon, seems to have been a pivotal character in the story of the development of our solar system, perhaps especially having a large influence in the development of the Lake Heavy bombardment, the rate of asteroid impacts that we receive, things like this. Anyway, to come back to 1625, this Jupiter-like planet had a hint of something in the data. But what I mean by that is when we looked at the transit, we got the familiar decrease in light that we always see when a planet travels in front of a star. But we saw something extra. Just on the edges, we saw some extra dips around the outside. It was right at the hairy edge of detectability. We didn't believe it because I think one of the challenges of looking for something for 10 years is that you become your own greatest skeptic. And no matter what you're shown, you're always thinking, it's like falling in love so many times and it not working out. You convince yourself it's never going to happen. Not for me. This isn't going to happen. And so I saw that and I didn't really believe it because I didn't dare let myself believe it. But being a good scientist, we knew we had an obligation to publish it, to talk about the result, and to follow it up and to try and resolve what was going on. So we asked for Hubble Space Telescope time, which was awarded in that case, and we were one of those lucky 20 that got telescope time. And we stared at it for about 40 hours continuously. And to provide some context, the dip that we saw in the Kepler data corresponded to a Neptune-sized moon around a Jupiter-sized planet, which was another reason why I was skeptical. I think that we didn't have that in the solar system. That seems so strange. And then when we got the Hubble data, it seemed to confirm exactly that. There was two really striking pieces of evidence in the data that suggested this moon was there. Another was a fairly clear second dip in light, pretty clearly resolved by Hubble. It was about a 5 sigma detection. And on top of that, we could see the planet didn't transit when it should have done. It actually transited earlier than we expected it to, by about 20 minutes or so. And so that's a hallmark of a gravitational interaction between the planet and the moon. We actually expected that. You can also expect that if the moon transits after the planet, then the planet should come in earlier than expected, because the barycenter, the center of mass, lives between the two of them, kind of like on a balancing arm between them. And so we saw that as well. So the phase signature matched up. The mass of the moon was measured to be Neptune mass, and the size of the moon was measured to be Neptune radius. And so everything just really lined up, and we spent months and months trying to kill it. This is my strategy for anything interesting. We just try and throw the kitchen sink at it and say, we must be triggered by something. And so we tried looking at the centroid motion of the telescope, at the different wavelength channels that have been observed, the pixel level information. And no matter what we did, we just couldn't get rid of it. And so we submitted to Science. And I think at the time, Science, which is one of the top journals, said to us, would you mind calling your paper Discovery of an Exomoon? And I had to push back, and we said, no, we're not calling it that. Even despite everything we've done, we're not calling it discovery, we're calling it evidence for an exomoon. Because for me, I want to see this repeat 2 times, 3 times, 4 times before I really would bet my house that this is the way to go. And I do worry, as I said, that perhaps that's my own skepticism, self-skepticism going too far. But I think it was the right decision, and since that paper came out, there has been continuous interest in the subject. Another team independently analysed that star and recovered actually pretty much exactly the same results as us, the same dip, the same wobble of the planet. And a third team looked at it and they actually got something different. They saw the dip was diminished compared to what we saw. They saw a little hint of a dip, but not as pronounced as what we saw. And they saw the wobble as well. So there's been a little bit of tension about analysing the reduction of the Hubble data. And so the only way in my mind to resolve this is just to look again. We actually did propose to Hubble straight after that. And we said, look, if our model is right, if the moon is there, it came in late last time. It transited after the planet. Because of the orbit, we can calculate that it should transit before the planet next time. If it's not there, it doesn't transit before, and even if we see a dip afterwards, we know that's not our moon. It's obviously some instrumental effect of the data. We had a causal prediction as to where the moon should be. And so I was really excited about that, but we didn't get the telescope time. And unfortunately, if you go further into the future, we no longer have the predictive capability, because it's like predicting the weather. You might be able to predict the weather next week to some level of accuracy, but predicting the weather next year becomes incredibly hard. The uncertainties just grow and compound as you go forward into the future more and more.
How are you able to know where the moon will be positioned? So you're able to tell the orbiting, like, geometry and frequency?
Yeah, so from the basically from the wobbles of the planet itself, that tells us the orbital motion of the moon, it's the reflex motion of the moon.
Isn't it just an estimate where, like, I'm concerned about you making a strong prediction here, because, like, if you don't get the moon where the moon needs on the next time around, if you didn't get Hubble time, couldn't that mean something else if you didn't see that? Like, because you said it would be an instrumental. I feel the strong urge to disprove your, which is a really good narrative. It's a good way to do science, but like, this is such a noisy signal, right? Or blurry signal, maybe. Low resolution signal.
Yeah, I mean, it's a 5 signal signal. So that's at the slightly uncomfortable edge. I mean, it's often said that for any detection of a first new phenomenon, you really want like a 20, 25 signal detection. Then there's just no doubt that what you're seeing is real. This was at that edge. I mean, I guess it's comparable to the Higgs boson, but the Higgs boson was slightly different because there was so much theoretical impetus to expect a signal at that precise location. A Neptune-sized moon was not predicted by anyone. There's no papers you can find that expect Neptune-sized moons around Jupiter-sized planets. So I think we were inherently skeptical about its reality for that reason. But this is science in action, and when we fit the bubbles, we fit the dips, and we have this 3D geometric model for the motion of the orbit, and projecting that forward, we found about 80% of our projections led to the moon to be before. So it's not 100%. There was maybe 20% of the cases it was over here. But to me, that was a hard enough projection that we felt confident that we could refute the experiment, which was what I really wanted. I wanted refutable. It's the basis of science, a falsifiable hypothesis. How can you make progress in science if you don't have a falsifiable, testable hypothesis? And so that was the beauty of this particular case.
So there's a numerical simulation with the moon that fits the data that we observed, and you can now make predictions based on that simulation.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Okay, it's fun. These are like little solar systems that we can simulate on the computer, imagine their motions, but we are pushing things to the very limits of what's possible, and that's a double-edged sword. It's both incredibly exciting intellectually, but you're always risking, to some degree, the pushing too far.
So I'd like to ask you about the recent paper you co-authored, an exomoon survey of 70 cool giant exoplanets, and the new candidate Kepler 1708 BI.
I'd say there's like 3 or 4 candidates at this point, of which we have published 2 of them. And to me, 2 are quite compelling and deserve follow-up observations. And so to get a confirmed detection, at least in our case, we need to see repeat for sure. One of the problems with some of the other methods that have been proposed is that you don't get that repeatability. So, for instance, an example of a technique that would lack that would be gravitational microlensing. So it's possible with a new telescope coming in the future, called the Roman Space Telescope, which is basically a repurposed spy satellite that's the size of the Hubble mirror going up into space. It will stare at millions of stars simultaneously, and it will look to see, instead of whether any of those stars get dimmer for a short amount of time, which will be a transit, it'll look for the opposite. It'll look to see if anything get brighter. And that brightness increase is caused by another planetary system passing in front, and then gravitationally lensing light around it to cause the brightening. And so this is a method of discovering an entire solar system, but only for a glimpse. You just get a short glimpse of it passing like a ship sailing through the night, just that one photo of it. Now the problem with that is that it's very difficult. The physics of gravitational lensing are not surprisingly quite complicated, and so there's many possible solutions. So you might have a solution, which is this could be a red dwarf star with a Jupiter-like planet around it. That's one solution. But another solution is that it's a free-floating planet, a rogue planet, like like Jupiter, with an Earth-like moon around it. And those two solutions are almost indistinguishable. Now, ideally, we would be able to repeat the observation. We'd be able to go back and see, well, if the moon really is there, then we can predict its mass, predict its motion, and expect it to be maybe over here next time or something. With microlensing, it's a one snapshot event. And so, for me, it's intriguing as a way of revealing something about the exomoon population. But I always come back to transits because it's the only method we really have that's absolutely repeatable, that we'll be able to come back and prove to everyone that, like, on the 17th of October, the moon will be over here, and the moon will look like this, and we can actually capture that image. And that's what we see with, of course, many exoplanets. So we want to get to that same point of full confidence, full confirmation of the slam dunk detection of these exomoons. But yeah, it's been a hell of a journey to try and push the field into that direction. And
is there some resistance to the transit method?
Not to the transit method, I just said to exomoons. So the transit method is by far the most popular method for looking for exoplanets. But yeah, as I've alluded to, exomoons is kind of a niche topic within the discipline of exoplanets. And that's largely because there are people I think are waiting for those slam dunks. And it was like if you go back to the first exoplanet discovery that was made in 1995 by Michel Mayor and Didier Queloz, I think it's true at the time that they were seen as mavericks, that the idea of looking for planets around stars was considered fringe science. And I'm sure many colleagues told them, why don't you do something more safe, like study eclipsing stars, two binary star systems? We know those exist, so why are you wasting your time looking for planets? You're going to get this alien moniker or something. You'll be seen as a fringe maverick scientist. And so I think it was quite difficult for those early planet hunters to get legitimacy and be taken seriously. And so very few people risked their careers to do it, except for those that were either emboldened to try or had maybe the career, maybe like a tenure or something, so they didn't have to necessarily worry about the implications of failure. And so once that happened, once they made the first discoveries, overnight, everyone and their dog was getting into exoplanets, and all of a sudden the whole astronomy community shifted, and huge numbers of people that were once upon a time studying eclipsing binaries changed to becoming exoplanet scientists. And so that was the first wave of exoplanet scientists. We're now in a kind of a second wave, or maybe third wave, where people like me, to some degree, kind of grew up with the idea of exoplanets as being normal. I was 11 years old, I guess, when the first exoplanet was discovered, and so to me it was a fairly normal idea to grow up with. And so we've been trained in exoplanets from the very beginning, and so that brings a different perspective to those who have maybe transitioned from a different career path. And so I suspect with exomoons and probably technosignatures, astrobiology, many other topics which I've seen at the fringes of what's possible, they will all open up and become mainstream one day. But there's a lot of people who are just waiting for that assuredness that there is a secure career net ahead of them before they commit.
Yeah, it does seem to be that exomoons open wider, or open for the first time, the door to aliens. Just more seriously academically studying, all right, let's look at like alien worlds. So I think it's still pretty fringe to talk about alien life, even on like at Mars and moons and so on. It kind of like, it would be nice, but imagine the first time to discover a living organism. That's going to change. Then everybody will look like an idiot for not focusing everything on this. Because the possibility of things, it's possible it might be super boring. It might be very boring bacteria, but even the existence of life elsewhere, that changes everything. That means life is everywhere.
Yeah. If you knew now that in 5 years, 10 years, the first life would be discovered elsewhere, you knew that in advance, it would surely affect the way you approach your entire career. Especially someone junior in astronomy, you would surely be like, well, this is clearly going to be the direction I have to dedicate my classes and my training and my education towards that direction.
All the new textbooks, all the burden. And I think there's a lot of value to hedging, like allocating some of the time to that possibility. Because the kind of discoveries we might get in the next few decades, it feels like we're on the verge of a lot of getting a lot of really good data and having better and better tools that can process that data. So there's just going to be a continuous increase of the kind of discoveries that will open. But a slam dunk, that's hard to come by.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are anticipating, we're already seeing it to some degree with Venus and the phosphine incident. But we've seen before with Bill Clinton and the White House announcing life from Mars. And there are inevitably going to be spurious claims, or at least claims which are ambiguous to some degree. There will be, for sure, a high-profile journal like Nature or Science that will one day publish a paper saying biosignature discovered or something like that on TRAPPIST-1 or some other planet. And then there will be years of back and forth in the literature. And that might seem frustrating, but that's how science works. That's the mechanism of science at play, of people scrutinizing the results to intense skepticism. And it's like a crucible. You burn away all the relevances until whatever is left is the truth. And so you're left with this product, which is that, okay, we either believe or don't believe that biosignatures are there. So there's inevitably going to be a lot of controversy and debate and argument about it. We just have to anticipate that. And so I think you have to basically have a thick skin to some degree academically to dive into that world. And you're seeing that with phosphine. It's been uncomfortable to watch from the outside, the kind of dialogue that some of the scientists have been having with each other about that, because
they get a little aggressive.
Yeah, and you can understand why, because
jealousy? I don't know. That's me saying, not you. That's me talking.
I'm sure there's some envy and jealousy involved on the behalf of those who are not part of the original discovery. But there's also, in any case, just the particular people involved in Venus alone, in any case of making a claim of that magnitude, especially life, because life is pretty much one of the biggest discoveries of all time that you can imagine scientifically. You can see, and I'm so conscious of this in myself when I get close to, as I said, even much smaller goals, setting an exomoon, the ego creeping. And so, as a scientist, we have to be so guarded against our own egos. You see the lights in your eyes of the Nobel Prize, or the fame and fortune and being remembered in the history books. And we all grew up in our training learning about Newton and Einstein, these giants of the field, Feynman and Maxwell. And you get the idea of these individual contributions which get immortalized for all time. And that's seductive. It's why many of us with the skill set to go into maybe banking instead decided, actually, there's something about the idea of being immortalized and contributing towards society in a permanent way that is more attractive than the financial reward of applying my skills elsewhere. So to some degree, that ego can be a benefit because it brings in skillful people into our field who might otherwise be tempted by money elsewhere. But on the other hand, the closer you get towards when you start flirting Nobel Prize in your eyes, or you think you're on the verge of seeing something, you can lose objectivity. A very famous example of this is Barnard's Star. There was a planet claimed there by Peter van der Kamp, I think it was in 1968, 69. And at the time, it would have been the first ever exoplanet ever claimed. And he felt assured this planet was there. He was actually using the wobbling star method, but using the positions of the stars to see them to claim this exoplanet. It turned out that this planet was not there. Subsequent analyses by both dynamicists and theorists and those looking at the instrumental data established fairly unanimously that there was no way this planet was really there. But Peter van der Kamp insisted it was there, despite overwhelming evidence that was accruing against him. And even to the day he died, which was, I think, in the early 90s, he was still insisting this planet was there, even when we were starting to make the first genuine exoplanet discoveries. And even at that point, I think Hubble had even looked at that star and had totally ruled out any possibility of what he was talking about. And so that's the problem. How do you get to a point as a scientist where you just can't accept anything that comes otherwise, because it starts out with the dream of fame, and then it ends in a stubborn refusal to ever back down.
Of course, the flip side of that is sometimes you need that to have the strength to carry a belief against the entire scientific community that resists your beliefs. And so it's a double-edged sword.
That can happen, but I guess the distinction here is evidence.
Yes.
So in this case, the evidence was so overwhelming. It wasn't really a matter of interpretation. It was you had to you'd observe this star with the same star, but with maybe 10, even 100 times greater precision for prolonged, much longer periods of time, and there was just no doubt to this point this planet was a mirage. And so that's why you have to be very careful. I always say, don't ever name, my wife, my daughter, like, name this planet after me that you discover. And like, I can't ever name a planet after you because I won't be objective anymore. How could I ever turn around to you and say that planet wasn't real, that I named after you?
So you're somebody that talks about, and it's clear in your eyes and the way of being, that you love the process of discovery, that joy and the magic of just, seeing something, new observation, a new idea, right? But I guess the point is, when you have that great feeling, is to then switch on the skepticism, like to start like testing, what does this actually mean? Is this real? What are the possible different interpretations that could make this a lot less grand than I first imagined? Yeah. So both have the wonder and the skepticism all in one brain.
Yeah, I think generally the more I want something to be true, the more I inherently doubt it. And I think that just comes from, I grew up with a religious family and was just sort of indoctrinated to some degree, like many children are, that this is normal, that there's a God and this is the way the world is. God created the earth. And then as I became more, well-read and literate of what was happening more scientifically, I started to doubt. And it really just struck me that the hardest thing to let go of when you do decide not to be religious anymore, and it's not really like a light bulb moment that just kind of happens over sort of 11 to 13, I think for me it was happening. But it's that sadness of letting go of this beautiful dream which you had in your mind of eternal life, for behaving yourself on earth. You would have this beautiful heaven you can go to and live forever, and that's very attractive. And for me personally, that was one of the things that pulled me against it. Was this? It's like it's too good to be true, and it's very convenient that this could be so. And I have no evidence directly in terms of scientific sense to support this hypothesis. And it just became really difficult to reconcile my growth as a scientist. And I know some people find that reconciliation. I have not. Maybe I will one day. But as a general guiding principle, which I think I obtained from that experience, was that I have to be extremely guarded about what I want to be true, because it's going to sway me to say things which are not true if I'm not careful. And that's not what we're trained to do as scientists.
So you felt from a religious perspective that there was a little bit of a gravitational field in terms of your opinions, like it was affecting how you could be as a scientist. Like as a scientific thinker, obviously you were really young.
Yeah, I think I think that's true. That whenever there's something you want to be true, it's the ultimate seduction intellectually. And I worry about this a lot with UFOs, and with it's true already with things like Venus, phosphine, and searching for astrological signals. We have to guard against this all the way through, from however we're looking for life, however we're looking for whatever this big question is. There is a part of us, I think, I would love there to be life in the universe. I hope there is life in the universe, but I'm somewhat been on record several times as being fairly firm about trying to remain consciously agnostic about that question. I don't want to make up my mind about what the answer is before I've collected evidence to inform that decision. That's how science should work. If I already know what the answer is, then what am I doing? And that's not a scientific experiment anymore. You've already decided, so what are you trying to learn? What's the point of doing the experiment if you already know what the answer is? There's no point.
It's so complicated because, so if I'm being honest with myself, when I imagine the universe, so first thing I imagine about our world is that we humans, and me certainly as one particular human, know very. My first assumption is that I know almost nothing about how anything works. So first of all, that actually applies for things that humans do know, like uh, quantum mechanics, and all the things that there's different expertises that I just have knowledge dedicated to. So even that's not good. But if you take all of knowledge as human civilization, we know almost nothing. That's kind of an assumption I have, because it seems like we keep discovering mysteries, and it seems like human history is defined by moments when we said, okay, we pretty much figured it all out, and we realized a century later, when you said that, you didn't figure out anything. Okay, so that's like a starting point. The second thing I have is I feel like the entirety of the universe is just filled with human civilization. Statistically, there's the important thing that enables that belief for me is that they don't have to be human-like. It could be anything. And it's just the fact that life exists and just seeing where life is on Earth, that it just finds a way. It finds a way in so many different complicated environments. It finds a way. Whatever that force is, that same force has to find a way elsewhere also. But then if I'm also being honest, I don't know how many hours in a day I spend seriously considering the possibility that we're alone. I don't know that when my heart is and mind are filled with wonder, I think about all the different life that's out there. But to really imagine that we're alone, and really imagine all the vastness that's out there, we're alone, and not even bacteria.
I would say you don't have to believe that we are alone, but you have to admit it's a possibility of our ignorance of the universe so far. You can have a belief about something in the absence of evidence. Carl Sagan famously described that as the definition of faith. If you believe something when there's no evidence, you have faith that there's life in the universe. But you can't demonstrate, you can't prove it mathematically, you can't show me evidence of that.
But is there some mathematical method? Is there the way physicists think, like intuition, or some basic reason? Is there some value to that?
Well, I'd say you can certainly make a very good argument. I think you've kind of already made one. Just the vastness of the universe is the default argument people often turn to. That surely there should be others out there. It's hard to imagine. There are of order of 10 to the 22 stars in our observable universe. And so really the question comes down to what's the probability of one of those 10 to 22 planets, let's say, Earth-like planets, if they don't have Earth-like planets, going on to form life spontaneously. That's the process of abiogenesis, the spontaneous emergence of life.
Also, the word spontaneous.
Well, again, maybe we won't use spontaneous, but not being, let's say, seeded by, say, some other civilization or something like that. But it naturally emerges.
Because even the word spontaneous makes it seem less likely.
Yeah.
Like there's chemistry and an extremely random process.
Right, it could be a very gradual process over millions of years of growing complexity in chemical networks.
Maybe there's a force in the universe that pushes it towards interesting complexity, pocket complexity, that ultimately creates something like life which we can't possibly define yet. And sometimes it manifests itself into something that looks like humans. It can be a totally different kind of computational information processing system that we're too dumb to even visualize.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird that complexity develops at all, right? Because it seems like the opposite to our physical intuition, training in physics of entropy, that things complexities are hard to spontaneously, well, I shouldn't say spontaneously, but hard to emerge and gender. And so that's an interesting problem. I think there's been, certainly from an evolutionary perspective, you do see growing complexity. But there's a nice argument, I think it's by Gould, who shows that if you have a certain amount of complexity, it can either become less complex or more complex through random mutation. And the less complex things are stripping away something that was necessary potentially to their survival. And so in general, that's going to be not particularly useful in its survival, and so it's going to be detrimental to strip away a significant amount of its useful traits. Whereas if you add something, the most typical thing that you add is probably not useful at all. It's probably just doesn't really affect its survival negatively, but neither does it provide any significant benefit. But sometimes, on rare occasions, of course, it will be a benefit. And so, if you have a certain level of complexity, it's hard to go back in complexity, but it's fairly easy to go forward with enough bites of the cherry. You will eventually build up a complexity, and that tends to be why we see complexity grow in certainly in the evolutionary sense, but also perhaps it's operating in chemical networks that led to the emergence of life. I guess the real problem I have with the numbers game, to come back to that, is that we are talking about a certain probability of that occurring. It may be to go from the primordial soup, however you want to call it, the ingredients that the earth started with, the organic molecules, the probability of going from that initial conditions to something that was capable of Darwinian natural selection that maybe we can define as life. The probability of that is maybe 1%, 1% of the time that happens, in which case you're right, the universe would be absolutely teeming with life. But it could also be 10 to the power minus 10, in which case it's 1 per galaxy, or 10 to the power of minus 100, in which case the vast majority of the universes even do not have life within it.
Or 90%.
Or 90%.
You said 1%. You said 1%. It could be 90% if the chemical conditions of the planet are correct, or our moon are correct.
I get that. It could be any of those numbers. And the challenge is we just have no rigorous reason to expect why 90% is any. Because we're talking about probability for probability. What is 90% more a priori likely than 10 to the power minus 20?
Well, the thing is, we do have an observation, M1, of Earth. And it's difficult to know what to do with that, what kind of intuition you put on top of that. Because on Earth, it seems like life finds a way. Okay. In all kinds of conditions, in all kinds of crazy conditions. And it's able to build up from the basic chemistry. You could say maybe it takes a little bit of time to develop some complicated technology like mitochondria, I don't know, like photosynthesis. Fine, but it seems to figure it out and do it extremely well.
Yeah, but I would say you're describing a different process. I mean, maybe I'm at fault for separating these two processes, but to me, you're describing basic natural selection evolution at that point. Whereas I'm really describing abiogenesis, which is to me a separate, distinct process.
You limit it to human sciences, yes, but why would it be a separate process? Why is the birth of life a separate process from the process of life? But why is it uncomfortable with the Big Bang, or uncomfortable with the first thing? Where does this come from?
Right. So I think I would say I just twist that question around and say you're saying why is it a different process? Why? And I would say why shouldn't it be a different process? Which isn't really a good defense, except to say that we have knowledge of how natural selection